And so for those who've joined, hi, my name's Nick. Welcome to this webinar from Transactional to Transformational. And we're waiting for a few more people to join at the moment. So while we're waiting, my colleague Becky from Action Learning Associates is going to put up a quick poll on your screens with 2 questions. And if you could answer those questions, that would be great. Thank you. We'll just wait for a couple of minutes for other people to join us. So we can see from the poll responses so far, there's most people in the group have some experience of action learning, and some people are very experienced, so that's good. And there's more people joining us now, so thank you. You'll see on your screen there's a short poll with a couple of questions just to give us a sense of what level of experience is in the room at the moment. So if you're happy to complete that just while we're waiting for a moment, that would be great. Thank you. That's great. The poll gives us, at a glance, an idea of what level of experience we have in the room today, which is fantastic. Thank you. It's good to see more people joining us. Welcome. So good. I think that gives us a good feel. So Becky, if you're happy to take the poll down, we can begin the webinar, and other people will join us as we go along. Good. So thank you. I'll bring some slides onto the screen, and I'll explain to you what we'll do today and how we'll do this in this webinar together. Okay, so I mentioned I'm Nick. Welcome to all of you who've joined today. I'm one of the directors at Action Learning Associates. And my colleague Becky's here with us today. She's from Action Learning Associates, and she'll be supporting us with any technological issues that may occur as we go along, as sometimes happens when we're doing things online. I just want to check if you can hear me okay. If you're happy to post yes in the chat, that will give us a sense of whether people can hear or not. It's just a quick tech check. Good. Sounds like you can hear me okay and you can see the screen. That's great. Thank you. So today, I work as a psychological coach and an action learning trainer, and I facilitated action learning through many years of experience, and I've worked in different countries doing this, and also with people from different cultural backgrounds. And given that background and experience, I'm always curious about, in those groups that work well, what is it that seems to make the difference? And also in groups that don't work so well, what is it that's making the difference? And one of the things I've noticed over the years is that sometimes when groups work well, people who've participated in the groups, they will say, you know, that was absolutely transformational for me. It isn't just that I managed to work on some tasks I was dealing with, something really fundamental shifted within me. And that's where sometimes this real sense of value that transcends any particular issue that participants are working on. And I'm really curious about that. What is it that makes the difference? And I have that conversation from time to time with individuals and the groups. And also I have my own reflections on that from those different years of experience. So what we'll be doing today is, for about 20 minutes, I will share some of the insights that I have derived from my own experience. And as I do that, I would encourage you to think about groups that you are working with or maybe would be working with, and how might these different insights and ideas apply in situations that you're in. After I've shared those insights and ideas, there'll then be chance for you to ask any questions. Now, when it comes to the questions part, we'd ask you to write them in the Q&A screen. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see Q&A. If you type your questions in there, when it comes to the question part, I'll do my best to answer as many of those questions as possible in the time available. Likewise, you may have your own experiences that will add to the things that I'm sharing today. And again, please feel free, if you want to type them into the Q&A box so that people can learn from them as well. So action learning, we could see from the poll at the beginning that some people already have some experience of action learning. Some people are very experienced in this. And for those who have the experience, you may be aware there are different approaches to action learning that are used by different action learning practitioners, different organizations, and sometimes in different parts of the world. But if you were to look for, if you like, a textbook definition of action learning, it's likely to include something like those things you can see on the screen. So typically in action learning, it's a meeting of a small group of peers. So that's people in similar roles, maybe in different organizations or sometimes in the same organization. And when the group meets, because typically an action learning group, which is often called a set, typically when a set meets, they will meet for more than one session to give everyone a chance to do this. And in any particular meeting, there'll be typically one person who shares a challenge that they are facing at work, and their peers will pose questions that help them to think through that for themselves. And at the end, the person who's thinking through the issue, they will choose their own actions. So you could think of these as core elements of action learning. And if you notice, they focus on the process of action learning. So somebody talks through an issue, other people ask questions, and they choose their own actions. So it's a process. And it also involves certain skills. So there's a skill in presenting an issue, sharing an issue so that other people are able to grasp it quickly, just as there are skills involved in asking really good questions that help that person to think it through for themselves. So these are some of the core elements of action learning. Yeah, what we notice is you could go to a group of people and just do those things, and sometimes it works well and sometimes it really doesn't. And it's as if there's something more than the process, and even something more than just the skills, that influences whether it is a transactional experience where people are able to work on tasks, or whether something deeper and more profound happens in a transformational sense. And that's what we'll be thinking through today. Now, we could think of these things that make a difference as success factors. So what is it that makes the difference? And what else, apart from process and skills, although it relates to them? Now, some of the success factors are very practical things. So, for instance, you'll be aware, having a venue that's free from distractions or free from being overheard by other people. And if it's online, similar, it's maybe having microphones turned off if there are background noises that could be distracting and such. I worked with one action learning set, and it was the first time we'd met. It was a group of people from different organizations. And at the beginning, people start to share some of the challenges they would find it useful to think through with each other. One of the women in the group, when it came to her turn to say what she would find useful, she said, "I'm not going to share anything with the group." And you can imagine the kind of, oh, you've come to an action learning set and you're not going to share anything with the group. And I was curious about that. So I said to her, if you were to share something today, something that really matters to you, what would you need? And she leaned towards the camera because it was an online group and she said, to be honest, if you could give me 10 minutes, I'll go home. And I could share from home. And so we paused the meeting for 10 minutes. When she rejoined, she said, in my office this morning, I just needed to make 2 people redundant. We're in an open plan office and I couldn't talk in that space openly. So it was a very practical thing, moving into a different physical space that then enabled her to contribute. Likewise, if you're working online, it's making sure you're using a platform, if it's Zoom, Teams, or whatever, that people are able to access. And also having stable internet access and things would all make a difference. If you're working with groups over a period of time, choosing the best timing, especially if they're international, people in different time zones and such, agreeing with the group how frequently you would like to meet, for how long, and to take breaks. Especially if you're online, it's taking breaks so that people don't develop what we often call Zoom fatigue. And you can just check with a group, what do you need? So if this was to be a successful experience for us, what would you need? And then you can negotiate that with the group. So these are some of the kind of the practical things that can make a difference. But today we're focusing primarily on, if you like, human-related factors, which are, if you like, psychologically, relational, and cultural type issues. Now, I'm going to share a number of these types of issues that, in my experience, make such a difference. And I'm going to describe them in terms of spirit of something. So it's not so much about a technical or practical thing. It's more about attitude, values, and a kind of creating a culture in a group that creates the conditions under which these successes are achieved. And at heart of this, you will notice as I go through these things, there's something about establishing, if any of you have heard of Gestalt psychology, it's about establishing a quality of contact between people in a group. It's like you're wanting people to almost like touch each other in terms of that level of connection in depth. And sometimes the transformation is coming through that quality of connection between people. So the first of these questions, or the first of these things, could be called a spirit of anticipation. Now, this is before people come to a first meeting, or it could be before they come to subsequent meetings. And it's about how do you get the right people involved, but also in the right spirit. There's something here about how you invite people to a group. So I would try, if I'm setting up a new group, to think, how can I invite people in a way that will capture their imagination, it will stimulate their imagination. And sometimes it means using language or metaphors that are meaningful for them and that they might use. So for instance, if you're working with a group of leaders, you might use something like make better decisions faster, because that's something that's likely to matter to them. Or if you're working with, say, an airline industry, it could be your chance to fly. So it's using things that could connect with your audience and that would matter, but it creates that sense of intrigue about what this could be like. I would also focus on the benefits. Sometimes when we describe action learning, if we're creating a poster or a flyer or something on a website, we talk a lot about what the process is. So this is a chance for you to come along and think through these questions with support from peers and stuff, but that's different to saying what some of the benefits could be for people. So people are attracted by what's the difference this could make. And sometimes if you have testimonials from peers who've done this before that they can connect with, that's the thing that will capture their interest. But the idea is to be creating that sense of anticipation of what could this thing be. In Action Learning Associates, if any of you have done our training, you'll notice that we typically do something like a taster session first to introduce some of the ideas and principles, philosophy, practices of action learning, and then give people a chance to try it. So there's something about understanding what it involves in doing this, so to do it well, but also having a go at doing it, because doing it is often quite different to thinking about it. Second thing, a spirit of curiosity, and that kind of builds on the anticipation you are creating. I worked with a group recently, it was about 6 weeks ago, and I put a slide up at the beginning. The first meeting just said, what are you curious about? And I invited the group to look at other people in the room that hadn't met each other before. And as you look at each other and you are wondering about each other, having not met, and it could be the same, they've not met me either, what are you curious about? And people did start to ask each other questions. It was different just to a standard introduction about name and role. It's like, I'm curious about, what was behind for you when you came to this, or if they're wearing a certain kind of clothing, what's that clothing mean for you? And it opened up some rich conversations. And people said afterwards, wow, we couldn't believe how much we connected with each other just by being curious. And it was in a non-threatening way. It was just a chance to ask each other questions that they're interested in. Now, when we're doing action learning, you could think of this as that the person who's sharing an issue, if they are curious about, I wonder how I might think about this differently, or how I might approach this differently. If they're in that state of curiosity, they're more likely to invite questions from the group and also invite challenges. Like, I really want to be stretched on this because there could be something I'm missing. So we wanted to create a state of curiosity for each of the individuals in a group. So they are wondering and they're inviting questions and challenge to stretch their thinking. For other people in the group, it gives them a chance to learn new skills, to be curious about how could I do this better? What might make a great question? What is it that seems to help a person to move forward in their thinking? And they could also be curious about, as a person does share an issue, they could be thinking, yeah, I wonder what I could learn from that for the situations I'm involved in. For the person who's doing the facilitating, it may be about, well, how well is the group serving the presenter, the person sharing an issue? How well are we doing this? And And what could we do that would make this even better next time? How can we work well as a group to help the person who's thinking something through to do it well? And one of the things I try to think about is that curiosity is an antidote to anxiety. So if people are coming to a group nervous about, what if I share something and I'm judged, or what if I'm making a mess of this and people are looking at me like, why are you doing so badly? If I'm in this place of curiosity, it's like it overcomes that anxiety, because it's like, I want to know. I really want to know. Next, and again, you'll see how these things relate, a spirit of relationship. I worked with an action learning set last year, and it was with quite a big group of people. It was unusual for an action learning set, and it had all different levels of hierarchy within the same small organization, in the same group together. Now, that isn't something I would normally recommend. For me, having hierarchical difference from the same organization in the same group can create some tricky dynamics in the group. It depends on levels of trust. Although diversity across peers from different backgrounds can really add richness, so people ask questions from different places. But in this group, because you had these hierarchical dynamics, I met with the leaders first to talk about how we might best do this, because they really wanted to try this with the whole organization. And the way the leaders approached it, they showed real vulnerability. They were so honest and so open when they talked with the group. It created this incredible sense of connection and trust as people. And some of the individuals in the group said, at the beginning, I wasn't really that keen on doing this process. I'm busy with other things. But because people are so willing to be vulnerable with each other and to support each other, I'm willing to commit to the other people in this room, even if I wasn't that willing to commit to a process. So that human sense of connection can be really powerful. One of the things we do in Action Learning Associates is at the beginning of an Action Learning set's development, we will create opportunities for people to get to know and understand each other. And that includes ourselves as facilitators, because again, it's that human connection. And we might share a question such as, just share something about your origins, however you want to define that, or your influences. So, how did you get here? What are the people or things that have mattered to you in your life? And when people share some of these things, it's amazing that sense of trust and connection that can begin to build. There's also real opportunity in action learning to capitalize on diversity. So rather than just what are the things we share in common, it's beginning to notice what are the things that are different between us that could help us to look at things and do things in new ways. So it's looking out for the diversity in the group and not just to try to make everything the same. So it's about being present to each other. It's about being sensitive. It's having empathy with each other and also building trust. Spirit of vulnerability. This touches again on the same thing. So I worked with one group. We worked together over a period of time and we did periodic reviews. And in a final review, I was interested to hear from them, what made the difference for you in this? What did you experience? What made the difference? And the people who were willing to make themselves vulnerable, so talking about things that were really difficult for them, really challenging, stretching things for them, and also people saying, I'm trying to ask a really good question here, but I'm not quite sure how to frame this. So there's that sense of vulnerability, but in the spirit of trust in the group. Where people have been willing to make themselves vulnerable, they typically said, I found this experience absolutely transformational. Those people who went through it fairly mechanistically, so, okay, I'll present an issue, you ask questions, I think about it. When they approached it more in a mechanical way, they said, well, it was kind of useful to think through those issues, but it didn't have the same transformational effect. So there's a relationship, I think, between vulnerability and transformation. Now, some of you may know Reg Revens, who was the founder of Action Learning. One of the things that he said is, when doing action learning, swap your difficulties, not your cleverness. Now, if you imagine, many people coming to the groups will be coming from backgrounds where in their career, they have managed to get to where they have now because they are bright, they're intelligent, they have good ideas, they have good experience. And that's often the thing which they can come to group thinking, almost like I need to impress other people in this group with what it is that I can contribute in that way. But Reg Revens, this founder, said, no, there's something about when we come together as a group where we are committed to each other in trust and we share the things we are really struggling with, that's where something can really happen that's powerful. So we're no longer needing to hide. It's like we can be honest and real and really work things through together. Some of you may know of an organizational writer, and he talks a lot about organizations, called Stephen Covey. I love it. He said, trust grows when you take a risk and you find yourself supported. In action learning, we're wanting to create a space in which people can take a risk. So sharing something maybe they're really struggling with. Sometimes people say this is the only chance I've ever had to talk about this, and they find themselves supported by the group. That can be so powerful. Now for the presenter, it's a chance for them to talk through something that maybe they've never talked about before, in order to really try and see if they can make a breakthrough on this, or even to step forward. And for the peers, it's also a chance to think about how might I frame questions in a way that really makes a difference, and how can I tune into maybe the questions others are asking and the journey that the person who's thinking through an issue is on. So it's really helping to make a difference. So the learning, and how can I apply that in other dimensions of my life and experience at work? The facilitator is the person who's often working with that group to help them to contract around ground rules. Now, it could include, well, if we were to bring our best to this and also get our best from this, what do we need? What do we need from the facilitator? What do we need from each other? But also, what do we need from ourselves? So contracting, really opening about those things, can be very powerful. And the facilitator not having all the answers, but being curious about those things with the group models, I think, that spirit of vulnerability. Those, again, who work with Action Learning Associates with groups, you'll also notice that periodically in sets, we'll be doing reviews of the process overall. So we're stepping back from the issues that people have been thinking through. It's like, how are we doing? How are we doing as an Action Learning set? What could make this the best it could be? And we could ask questions such as, well, what's going well? So what are the things we're doing well, want to build on next time we meet? And what are the things that would make it even better next time? And to have honest conversations. So it's an ongoing process of learning and developing and becoming more and more powerful as a group, and more transformational. Now, you could say the flip side of the same coin of vulnerability is a spirit of courage. Now, some of the groups I've worked with, when, again, we've reviewed, sometimes it's the end of a meeting, sometimes it might be the end of a series of meetings. One of the things I quite often hear from people is saying, do you know, I wish the group had been more challenging. So people might say, I was thinking through an issue, and people did ask questions to help me think it through, but they were quite polite and they were being very sensitive to me, but it didn't feel like that edge, that stretch. So something there about the person who's thinking through an issue, they can guide the group in terms of how much challenge do they want to really stretch them to think through something. And it's to do that in a way that doesn't feel threatening, it feels safe, but at the same time it's got that edge to it. People are often looking for more challenge that sometimes other people in the group feel ready to give because they're too nervous about maybe they'll upset that person, or maybe make them feel too vulnerable. So having that conversation in the group can be powerful. What it means for participants is, before they come to an action learning set, to encourage them to prepare themselves to be in a state of curiosity we've already been thinking about, and to think about everything the group does as a bit like an experiment. We'll try things and we'll see what happens when we do it, and we'll learn from that. And that models what we're also wanting them to do when they leave the meeting in their own work context. Now, there's something here about helping people to prepare themselves psychologically and emotionally for this engagement as a group, which is different to simply doing the transactional stuff that you might do in a meeting. Sometimes in Action Learning Associates, we use focusing exercises at the start, because people sometimes come to meetings, especially online meetings, from other things. That may be what's like for you today. You come to this meeting having just come out of another meeting, and people's thoughts are all over the place. And sometimes we'll do a focusing exercise that allows people just to breathe and to rest in that moment, and to prepare themselves to engage in what we are doing here in this moment and now. Now, the experimenting and reporting back is essentially about, we will try something in the group and we'll see how it goes, and we'll learn from this, and we'll do the what's going well, even better if. When people then take away an action from the end of the meeting, they might say, you know, having had a chance to think about this, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. It's recognizing that the trying solutions in a situation that could be really complex, and they don't yet know if those things will work. And so often groups will say, well, when we come back next time, it'd be great to hear what happened when you try those things and what can we learn from that. So it's an ongoing process of learning. I would also say one of the things that I've discovered myself as a participant in action learning, as well as a facilitator, is to try to learn to trust our intuition. For some of you, this may be really natural for you. Sometimes I have an intuitive sense. It almost feels like it's at the back of my head behind me. It's like something, as the person's talking, there's something that's just beginning to form in the back of my mind. And what I'm learning to do is simply to share that intuition. It might not be fully formed, but to share it and to frame it where I can as a question. And often people say, you know, that is the thing that touched on something that is really important for me, even though I hadn't yet articulated it. So it's trusting our intuition. What I've also discovered is that the more we treat everything as an experiment, so we'll try it and see what happens, we'll do our best in this and we'll learn from it, is it frees people up from having to try to do everything perfectly. So some people come to group anxious. What if I don't present the issue well enough? Or what if I don't ask the perfect question? If everything's an experiment, so well, let's try it. Let's try something, see what happens when we do it, and we'll learn from that. And that's when groups can become more transformational, because they're in a place where they can practice and try things. Now, linked to that, this idea of intuition, if you like, is you could call it a spirit of discernment. I worked with one group where it was a very enthusiastic group of participants. One person was talking through an issue, others were asking questions. And the person who was receiving the question said, you know, before I even had a chance to answer the question, somebody asked me another question. And it felt like being machine gunned with questions. So they said, it's like, I'm just getting too many questions. I have no chance to think. So I said to the person who was in that state, well, what would you need from the group that would make this more useful for you? And they said, how about when somebody asks a question, nobody else asks a question until I'm ready to move on. So if I want to think about it, I'll think about it. If I simply want to say thank you for the question, I can say that. If I want to write something down, I can do it. And when I'm ready to move on, I will then signal to the group, okay, I'm ready for another question. So the person who was thinking through the issue, it's like as if they were exercising agency within the meeting. They were thinking, how shall I do this? Rather than just being passive and in receipt of things from other people in the group. I like to think of it, if you imagine the person who's thinking through an issue as a bit like on the journey, it's like they're on a path deep in thought, thinking through something, and the other people are simply posing questions, a bit like nudges, short, simple questions that may be prompts that help them to move on that journey, but without distracting them from the journey with long or complex questions. So it's walking with someone and it's trying to tune into where is that person going on this journey, and just giving nudges or space to help them to move forward. Now, sometimes what you'll notice is when people are asked questions, it's like they're sitting with a challenge. It's like there's something's going on, and you can see them sometimes looking up, or they might sit back in the seat. There's something that looks as if there's an active process going on for them. Now, sometimes that's also true for the people who are posing questions. You can see it's like they're trying to think, what is this question that's forming for me that I want to pose? And as a facilitator and as participants, it's wanting to learn to notice the difference between a thinking silence, so when there's something really active going on and allowing that space, or a stuck silence when somebody simply seems, the person just seems completely blank. They've come to a complete stop. And when a person's in that place, you can be asking, so what would you need? What would you need at this point to make this useful for us and as we move forward? So it's like it's tuning into that reflective side of action learning. It's reflecting on our own learning, reflecting what's going on for other people, and moving forward in that spirit of reflection. One of the things I've needed to learn as a facilitator is the temptation, or to avoid the temptation of stepping into rescue too quickly. And this often happens for people asking questions. Somebody may go very quiet. So others are thinking, oh no, I need to ask a question. The silence is difficult. Or I may have been thinking, oh no, the person's got stuck, so we need to do something else. Whereas sometimes the person's struggling with something, but they're struggling in a wrestling, a positive way. It's like, I'm almost there on this. I just need some more space to think about this. So it's not jumping in too quickly to rescue when actually the person maybe doesn't need rescue. They just need space to wrestle with this more. The final area, which I've already mentioned briefly, there was the spirit of agency. Now, you could think of this as a bit like the action dimension of action learning. So it's not only a reflective process, not only a thinking process, it's a doing something process, and that's key to action learning. I worked with one organization where we met together as a group, and these were people from different parts of the same organization. And it was our first time of meeting, but they had met periodically over a number of years actually previously. And they said the reason we want to do this is because every time we meet together, we all talk about the same issues, we all share the same frustrations, we all talk about the same ideas that would make a difference, and nothing happens. And a year later we come back, or however frequently they meet, and we talk about the same issues again. And it is so frustrating. You can feel this frustration in the room. So in action learning, it's wanting to create that sense of agency, and that may be an alien word for some of you, but it's around owning something. So it's like, I'm going to take responsibility for doing something in the situation. And it's about making a choice. So of all the different things I could do, I'm going to choose to do this. I will do this, and then to do it. And the way I think about this agency thing is a bit like if any of you drive a car, when you are letting out the clutch, it's like it just begins to bite. You've got that traction as the car starts to move. It's trying to work with somebody so there's that sense of traction on the issue they are grappling with, so it creates some movement. And that's a movement that will continue when they leave. So this means that when a person brings an issue to an action learning set, it needs to be something of which they are able realistically to influence or control, even at times, change. If they're presenting a macro issue where there's no chance to influence change in it, it could be an interesting discussion, but it's not the best issue for action learning because it's that sense of getting traction on something in order to influence change. In the meeting itself, in order to encourage that spirit of agency, I will be encouraging the person who is presenting in the sense of thinking through an issue, when it's their space to do that, to take ownership of that space and to guide the group in terms of what they would find useful. So the person's already learning that skill of it's like, this is something I'm dealing with, and I'm going to then guide the group on what will resource me to tackle this. And it's really useful for the group. It also creates that sense, I'm owning this. And if any of you are familiar with this expression of holding, we often talk about holding someone else's feet to the fire. In action learning, it's often holding my own feet to the fire. That's to make myself accountable for something, so that when I leave the meeting, it's like, I will do something about this. And sometimes people would even write, if you're in a physical room together, or it could be in a chat, I will, ... This is the action I will take. And next time I'll come back and I'll tell you what happened when I tried to do it. Okay. That brings us to the end of the slide. So I'll come off share at this point in time. What we're going to do now is, having shared those things quickly, a whole range of different areas there, it's a chance if you have any questions you'd like to ask. And as I've mentioned before, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A, I was going to say button, icon on your screen. And if you type your questions in there, I will do my best to answer them as well as I can in the time we have available. So if you'd like to do that now, I will look at the Q&A box and I'll see if any questions emerge there. Likewise, if you have any other things that you would add to the things that I've shared that you think could be useful to share with others around, I found this also makes a difference, then please do feel free to share that. I'll just give you a moment to think to do that. Okay, so while we're waiting, there's no questions there yet. Questions appearing. Okay, so with people from different hierarchy, did they have to be nudged more open? Yeah, I guess that's referring to the example I gave where we're working with a group of people who were in different hierarchical levels in the same group. What we did was we had a conversation as a whole group before we moved into doing the action learning about what would make this useful for them and what are the conditions that they would need to have fulfilled individually and as a group to make this useful. Because at first some people said, quite honestly, if I'm sitting here with my boss in the room, there's things I won't talk about. And so we had a conversation, well, if you were to talk about that, what would you need? Or where are the boundaries around some of the things we discuss here? And what would we do if it's like a boundary is being crossed? How would we flag that so it doesn't make people feel overly vulnerable or uncomfortable in that? So it was contracting with the whole group around what would they need to get the best that they could from each other and from the process, bearing in mind some of those hierarchical issues. So I hope that answers that question. Would you recommend using would you recommend using action learning as part of setting up a network group? I guess that's a great question. I guess it partly depends on what the function of the network group is. So if it's simply a place for people to come together, get to know each other, a kind of relationship building, action learning could help. Some aspects of action learning could help with that. If it's a network that says, well, let's look at how we can draw on each other's expertise to address some of the issues that we find ourselves facing individually or as a group, if that's one of the purposes of the network, then it could be very powerful. Thank you. I'm just scrolling back up my screen here. Okay, how can diversity affect a sense of belonging and transformational experiences? Yeah, great question. In my own experience, the greater diversity in the group, and I will use this carefully, laterally, so differences in experience among peers, different experience and backgrounds, it can be one of the most powerful dimensions of action learning. It can also be one of those things that makes it really difficult because if people are genuinely very different to each other in some key respects, trying to create that sense of knowing and understanding each other well is really, really important. So at the beginning, when I'm working with an action learning set, especially if it's a very diverse group, is to particularly focus on things like origins and influences. How can we know and understand each other best so we're able to then bring and contribute and draw on the best of each other? So it's having that conversation about how we would draw in this diversity and what might we need in a group, given those diverse backgrounds and perspectives, for this to be a safe place and also really constructive space. Thank you. What do you feel is the most important underlying theory of action learning? Wow. There are lots of theories behind action learning. One of those that I find particularly useful is, you may have come across, I think it's Chris Argyris, who talks about double loop learning and triple loop learning. Forgive me if I've got the wrong theorist there, but this idea of thinking outside of the assumptions that we're normally making, or even thinking outside of the situation we're thinking about. Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, some of you may have heard of. She works at Harvard Business School, I think. I was just thinking about something she said the other day. It's when we try to think about things in new ways and to approach things differently in order to get different results, she will talk about, we don't just need to think outside the box, we need to think outside the building. Now, it's a great metaphor, but it's about how do we find ways to challenge our own assumptions so we're able to think about things in new ways that we might not even know we are not thinking about. So I love Rosabeth Moss-Kanter. Everything she writes, I think, is great. Chris Argyris, I think it is maybe with Donald Schoen. They talk about this idea of double and triple loop learning that I find incredibly powerful as well. So it's learning to think outside of our normal way of thinking of things to see what new insights emerge. Thank you. Do you ask in the reflection about transformative experience? I'm not sure what the question means, but I will guess if that's okay. So when we're doing the reflections on how we are working well together, maybe the question means, so are we asking people how they're experiencing that? How transformational is this experience so far? Yeah, I will ask people at the beginning of an action learning. So if we were to do something that resulted in significant change for you, what is the change you would love to see? And then we'd have a conversation about how well are we meeting that, because some of that would be how well we're working together. Now that moves, because sometimes when people join the group, they just want to work on a particular task. But when they begin to experience some of the benefit, they think actually something deeper going on here, and it changes what they now aspire to from the group. So it's working with the group to look at where do you want to go with this and what could make the biggest difference for you. And the typical thing that people will say is, I want us to up the challenge. Now, doing that means it needs to be agreed with the group, because so the challenge doesn't feel threatening. But people will often say, the more vulnerable I'm willing to be, the more risks I'm willing to take, and the more risks other people are willing to take in asking questions, that can make such a big difference for me. I hope I understood the question properly. Thank you. I'm interested in your experience of working virtually versus in person in terms of transactional versus transformational action learning experiences. Yeah, interesting question. I guess the pandemic has brought this, the COVID pandemic brought this reality of working together virtually into our world much more than previously we may have had experience of. And I think I was skeptical at first, to be honest, about when we're working on things like Zoom, like now, we're often just focusing on tasks. So we come from one task meeting to another task meeting. It's often about the task. what I found is that when we do that trust building stuff around things like origins and influences, when we contract well, when we create that spirit of experimentation, which invites vulnerability, when we do that kind of ongoing process of review, it works very powerfully online, just as it does working in room. And I was surprised by that, to be honest. I didn't imagine that. Having said that, when I'm working physically with groups of people in the room, there's something about that human connection that when you're all together in the same room, there's something qualitatively different about it that's sometimes quite difficult to pin down. So I would say the biggest thing for me, if you're working online, is not to jump straight into the action learning task, so to speak, but to really work on the thing about knowing, understanding, and connecting with each other as human beings in that space, whilst moving on to the action learning. That can easily get lost in the virtual world in a way it's less likely to in the physical world when you shake hands, share coffees and things. Thank you. Mentoring, coaching support, a viable goal for action learning rather than just achieving operational change, right? I will just think about that question for a moment, if that's okay. I'm not sure I've understood the question, so I'm just thinking for a moment. Yeah, maybe the question here is about, providing something like mentoring and coaching, which could be about personal development and professional development, not just achieving a practical task change within an organization. So if I've understood this correctly, maybe it's about, can action learning enable similar things that you might achieve through mentoring and coaching, and not just achieving a task at work? I would say absolutely yes, if I've understood the question correctly, because action learning, in my experience, works best when it focuses on things which are really important to individuals. And when the person's thinking through motivation, confidence, assumptions they're making and such, it is transformational for the person in the way that mentoring and coaching can be. And it's about how they then apply that shift to influence change in a work situation. But the shift is something which will transform all different dimensions of their lives. And particularly for those in leadership, it's often people saying, wow, this has totally transformed my leadership, not just a task that I presented, because I'm seeing myself in the situations I'm working in and the people I'm working with through different eyes. I hope that's answered that question. Thank you. Whoops, my screen has just blipped a bit here. Please tell me, Becky, if I'm jumping into questions. I'm hoping to transition a group to be self-facilitating. Yeah, that's a good question, that, because often with groups, they start with an external facilitator to help them to develop the skills and practice of action learning, but then they move on to do that for themselves. When I'm helping groups to work through that transition, we might start by looking at what are the particular roles that need to be fulfilled if they're to work together well, and they will look on what's the role of a facilitator been, and what are the roles of people who've presented been. So how will we decide who presents and how much time we give them, things like that. And also for those who are asking questions, it's like, well, how has that worked for us? So there's something being really clear about the roles, and if they were to move forward now as a group, how would they fulfill those roles? And sometimes I say, well, how about we took turns as a facilitator? And then we can agree between us how much time we give to our meetings and how much time for each person. But it's helping them to think through what are the issues that they would need to think through for themselves in advance, so that when they become self-facilitating, they've already thought about those things. I will also work with them on troubleshooting. So it could be, given their experience of action and given mind, what are some of the things that can go wrong? And one of the things that can happen is, especially if you don't have an external facilitator there, and if groups are not yet that experienced, they may just start to discuss issues rather than really focusing on, okay, so where's the real nub of this? Where could I influence change? What will I do at more of a personal level? And so it's about, how do we make sure that if there are issues we'd find useful to discuss in that way, we separate them from action learning and maybe address them outside of the action learning meeting. So it would be about roles and troubleshooting some of the things. And I would also ask them, well, what are the things they anticipating working well, and what the things they anticipate could be tricky for them that they'd like to think through with my experience while I'm still with them. And action learning associates will also sometimes say to people, if you want to come back and touch base with us as you move along in this work, do so that the facilitator or the group have a chance to think outside of that process, to review how it's going and again, see what they might do differently to enhance that. I hope that helps to answer that question. Thank you. What length of time do you prefer in ALS online? Yeah, I think that's a really good question as well, because sometimes when we're working online, it's really tiring. And I think it's tiring sometimes because we're only seeing head and shoulders typically of the people that we are connecting with, and we're staring at a screen at a fixed distance. And when we're with people in a physical room, we're picking up all sorts of cues from people's body language and things that you don't get when you're just staring at somebody on a screen, head and shoulders. And I think for those kinds of reasons, as if our mind's searching for these cues that we can't see, and it's one of the things can create tiredness. So in the work that I do, the typical length we would do online action learning sets would be something like, yeah, I would say 3.5, 4 hours, something like that. Having said that, some groups say we want to meet for a whole day because it gives us a chance to cover a lot of ground while we're all together, and it's difficult to find dates that will, you know, work in all of our diaries together. So sometimes groups will want to work for a whole day. I'm working with some groups at the moment that want to work for a whole day, just because I said this is the most efficient way for us to do this as a group. But we then build in lots of breaks so that people stay fresh and engaged rather than just becoming more and more tired and exhausted as the day goes on. And I will say to the group, in terms of exercising agency, if you need a break, if you need anything at any point, please flag that. Because what's important is we then do whatever it is that needs to be done to enable people to bring the best. So we then do get the best from this experience rather than just slavishly going through something that could feel exhausting. Thank you. Is there any research evidence about the effectiveness of action learning? My clients like to know that things work and why. That's a good question as well. Yeah, there's something called the Revans Institute of Action Learning. They do a lot of work. Revans is from Reg Revans, who I mentioned earlier as the founder of this. And it would definitely be worth looking at their website to have a look at research that's been done that demonstrates the effectiveness of action learning, and also what are the conditions that influence the effectiveness of action learning. Thank you. How can we ensure that action learning members commit to each other and that the AS doesn't run out of steam? Yeah, this does sometimes happen if people kind of appear and disappear in a patchy way. It's like as if the whole group dynamic starts to dissipate and more people drop out. So I would always start with an action learning group to have a conversation with a group about what action learning is, how it works, what makes it successful, and then to have a conversation with a group about the level of willingness to commit to this. So if you were to do this, if you were to commit for what this is going to call for from you, what would need to happen to enable you to make that level of commitment? Because sometimes people say, oh, yeah, I'll do it if I can fit it in with other things. Another meeting came up, I got called out, and the whole thing could start to fall to pieces. So it's having a really open and honest conversation with the group. And I will have that conversation after I've already explained what action learning is about, and also we've had a chance to try it. So having an understanding of it, having that chance to go it, to feel something of the power of this, it's like, okay, if we were to do this, and if everyone was to commit to making this work, what would you need to make this work for you? And sometimes people say, look, to be honest, if we could do it afternoons or on this particular date, I'm more likely to be able to make it. If somebody, I had one meeting where a group where one person kept dropping out of meetings because said something came up, and I just had a conversation with them about, is this something that you are willing to commit to or even able to commit to? And if not, I think it's better to make a choice to leave rather than to continue on the group uncertainty in the group, and have that conversation with the group as well. So it's very difficult to manage if once people do start disappearing, in my experience, a bit like a car where the wheels are falling off and the whole thing can fall apart. So I would have very honest, upfront conversations with the group. What are you willing to commit to and what would you need to do that? Thank you. What would you say are the unique benefits of peer learning versus coaching and mentorship? Great question. In my experience, I often work as a coach with individuals, and when I'm working as a coach with an individual, as we are thinking through an issue together, there'll be certain insights will come to mind for me that I could frame as questions that help that person to shift in the things that they want to make a shift in. One of the greatest benefits in action learning is you're working effectively with, a bit like having a group of coaches around you. And if it's a diverse group, it's people coming from very different perspectives and experience bases who are not making the same assumptions as each other or as the person presenting in a sense of sharing an issue. So the advantage for me of peer learning and action learning set is you have access to a range of different people who are bringing different perspectives that are reflected in the kind of issues that we'll even think about or questions we'll think of posing. And I think that can be incredibly powerful. It's why I would always advocate greatest possible diversity laterally, but not hierarchically. Thank you. I have a group that has explored one challenge with each member. They want to keep meeting. Should we go over the previous challenges again and update on progress? Or should I invite everyone to offer a second challenging issue? Good question. This is a question often arises with self-facilitating groups as well. Now, I would say if we think of this idea of experimentation, ongoing journey of learning, what some groups will do is they will say, each time a person has presented a challenge and they've had a chance to go away and try something, if they're willing to come back in the following meeting, even for a short time, to say, well, look, this is what I said I would do. This is what I tried doing. This is what happened. The group could have a quick conversation around what was it that made the difference. So it almost like closes a loop for the group, and it gives them a chance to learn from what happened when they tried to do it in practice. Or even if they didn't do it, what happened and what can we learn from that when we make future commitments. So for some groups, I know that they find that really useful because it provides, some people say, I know that if I'm going to report back to my group, I'm more likely to do it. So it's almost like creating a peer accountability structure for some people. In other groups, what they will say is, look, we don't have sufficient time available to do that. What we prefer to do is just whatever issues are real for us in the moment, that's what we'll focus our attention on. So it sounds like the group you're working with, it may be a conversation to have with them about what would they find most useful to review actions that have happened in the past or to move on to new things now, rather than you needing to make that decision as a facilitator. I hope that helps. Thank you. Can you give the link for the Reverend's Institute, as I'm not sure that exists any longer? Oh, there we go, Journal of Action Learning Research and Practice. Now, when I don't know if this is true now, but the Journal of Action Learning Research and Practice, I think used to be done by the Reverend's Institute. So I don't know if, Becky, when we send out an email afterwards, if we can find links that we could send to people for that, and you and I could have that conversation afterwards, just to check I've got my information right there. Is that okay?
Hi, yep, that's fine.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for such great questions and for being willing to engage in this. I hope my responses to those questions have at least been partway useful. I would encourage you with your own groups to also be noticing what is it that seems to make the difference, and also encouraging your groups to notice what is it that seems to make the difference in terms of their experience of this, and whether it is transactional or whether something more transformational is happening for them, and to have that conversation with them. We have another question has appeared. What's been your greatest challenge in creating transformational experience? I think that's a good question. That relates, I guess, to the last question that somebody posed around what happens if people appear and disappear and things. In my experience, if you have a group where participants are sporadic in their attendance for whatever reason, it can be so disruptive to that trust dynamic in the group that people then feel as if maybe they're waiting for someone to join. They haven't yet joined. Are they joining us? Are they not joining us? Who shall present this time? Because we thought they were presenting, that kind of thing. So the uncertainty created by sporadic attendance is one of those things that, in my experience, can make it very difficult to achieve some of those transformational experiences that happen over time as a group develops trust and goes deeper. Thank you.
Nick, there were just 2 questions in the chat box, which you might want to answer.
I'm just trying to find the chat box now. This is my tech challenge here. Okay, here we go. Thank you for picking up, Becky. Right, I'm just checking I've got the correct. Have you or your colleagues found a range of commitment to action learning sets over the last couple of years, especially during lockdown? Use of virtual format and returning face-to-face. Yeah, it's been interesting for me. I imagine, to be honest, at the beginning of the COVID crisis, if you like, in the early days, what I found is lots of people, so we are so busy, because it was working with leaders, we're so busy trying to firefight in this situation, we don't have time to do this, even though we think it could be really useful for us. That was about the first 3 months. after that, the number of people who are wanting to do action learning to me rocketed. So I've never spent so much time running action learning sets. And I think it's because people had managed to step back a little from the immediate crisis, think, so how do we navigate through something that is so complex and so uncertain? And then people were recognizing, if I have a chance to think this through with peers rather than just trying to think it through on my own, especially peers who are facing similar things, there's such a potential to learn in that. And we needed to do it online because of restrictions around meeting together physically and travel and such. A number of the groups I've worked with, they found it so powerful, they've continued working online, typically because sometimes it gives people easier access than rather than to travel. And it also makes it possible for groups to meet internationally. So if you have people working from different countries together, which is often the case in the groups I'm working with, it's more cost effective to do that online than trying to come together face to face. Having said that, some groups, so to be honest, it's so much better when we're able to meet face to face because there's a relational dimension to this, which is sometimes easier to build face to face than it would be doing it online. And when it's efficient to them to do that, they then do that. Thank you. I'm looking at questions in different places now. We've still got 5 minutes, so I'll try to respond as well as I can. I'd love to do an in-house action learning set. Guessing it will need to be optional. Yeah, good thing. If you're organizing an in-house action learning set, it's a tricky one because sometimes you've got a sense that action learning could be really powerful, but you may have people in the organization who've never heard of it, and it sounds really weird. Action learning, what's that? And if you try to describe it as a process, it can leave them also confused. So I would go back to thinking, who might the people this could be useful for? If they were to do it, what would they find useful? And you could have those conversations, if possible, with them and individually or sample individually, and then think about how we might frame this to address some of the things which they would find most useful to address. And then you're more likely to have buy-in because it connects with things that already matter to people, rather than trying to win them over to something which you might think is great, but they might not. So optional, definitely. If you try to force people to do action learning, like any kind of learning, you typically experience all kinds of pushback. So yeah, finding out what's the benefit this could be for whom, and then having a conversation. If we were to do this, what would make them choose to do this among everything else they could be spending the time on? Can be a powerful way to do it. As I mentioned earlier as well, if there are peers that they would recognize and respect who've already done this and found it useful, they can be great people to draw on for testimonials, and they could just say, well, I did this. I worked in one organization where I wanted to introduce action learning and coaching, and I met with the leadership team, and it was the extended leadership team, so the executive team plus the next layer of leaders, if you like, in their hierarchy. And rather than trying to sell them an idea, I found out beforehand which people had already done this, like coaching, action learning. And I simply invited the leaders together and gave those people a chance to feedback, what is it I did and what difference has it made? And to get them to be really, really honest rather than trying to spin something. At the end of that meeting, the full leadership bought into doing action learning and coaching because they'd heard it from peers. So something about peers that can be really, really powerful. Thank you. Okay, one more question. I'm just having a quick skim down the questions here to see if there's one I can most usefully answer. So what kind of
sorry, Nick, very quickly, while Nick's just doing the last question, I'm just going to pop an exit poll as people are having to disappear. So I'm just going to pop an exit poll up. If you could answer that while listening, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Becky, are you able to capture the webinar chat? Is that something that's capturable?
Yeah, we've got the questions and the chat.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. What kind of adjustments have you made for people with limited short-term memory, long-term, long COVID dyslexia? Again, great question. One of the things we've found, and this is especially during the COVID period, where issues around people with COVID, including myself, really struggling with concentration. Again, what we've done is when we've worked with people, if you're setting up a new group, it's finding out what would people need for this to work for them and having those really honest conversations. So when I had COVID a few months ago now, and I could hardly think for about 3 months. It badly affected my thinking, and it meant we would just simply agree with each other. We'll take longer breaks to do something else, like and for people to be really honest about if I need a break, we will just take the break. So that contracting and ground rule setting with the group, where people can be really honest about what they would need to bring their best and also take the best from it, to me is really, really important in this. And that would be difficult. That would be different to me trying to second guess what they might want or find useful. Let's have that conversation. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I'm sorry, we'll need to come to an end there with the questions. Thank you to everyone for joining this webinar. I hope you found that useful. I hope there's some insights there you can apply to your own practice. If you want any further information about action learning and developing your expertise in action learning, please do have a look at the Action Learning Associates website. Thank you for completing the polls. That is really helpful as feedback for us as well. As I mentioned, Becky will send out an email with a link to a recording of the webinar afterwards, which addresses one of the questions I can see just popped up there in chat. And if you want a PDF of the slides that I've shown today, let Becky know, and she will also send that out to you. So thank you to all of you, and goodbye.